So this is the overview video for week 4 of our online Brit Lit II course, reading list B on Empire. Now, the British Empire was an incredibly important force in shaping Victorian understandings of themselves, in shaping British identity. At its height, the empire controlled a quarter of the globe. So, India was sort of the main colony. India was one of the most important colonies. It was called the jewel in the crown. And after 1857, it was directly ruled by the British government itself. So you had India, you had West Africa, Egypt, and a sort of strip down through Kenya and sort of East Central Africa, and then you had all of Southern Africa, which were owned by the British. Various islands throughout the Caribbean, Jamaica and places like that. Canada, and actually Canada and Australia were in a unique position within the British Empire because they came to be viewed as almost equal partners, mostly because they were what were called settler colonies. So even though Australia had started out as a penal colony, the settler colonies were predominantly populated by people of Northern European descent. British, Welsh, Scottish, Irish, and English. And so they were white colonies, whereas India was predominantly populated by Indians. The African colonies were predominantly populated by various tribes of Africans. Jamaica was predominantly African and indigenous. Many of the islands in the Pacific remained sort of dominated by Pacific Islanders and things like this. So Canada and Australia really were white colonies, and that's sort of what it comes down to in terms of their particular status in the empire. But places like Africa were very much places like the colonies in Africa, rather, not Africa as a whole, because it was divided, particularly in 1888, because in 1888 there was a conference in Berlin where European powers basically sort of took a map of Africa and drew lines and said, all right, this is British and this is French and Germany gets this and what have you. It was called the Scramble for Africa, actually, this sort of great movement to colonize all of Africa. But the African colonies, Nigeria, Ghana, Egypt, Kenya, South Africa, all of these places were very much regarded as colonies to be controlled by the British because they were not white, essentially, because they were black Africans or they were North African Arabs, whatever it was. Territories in the Middle East, same thing, and India. So, to a certain degree, the empire was run on racism, but it's not as simple as I think we often want to think of racism, because the British genuinely believed that they were going out and doing good work in the world. They genuinely believed that colonization was a task for them, that it was a job that had been given maybe by God for them to go out and to civilize these ostensibly uncivilized peoples, to cultivate these ostensibly uncultivated areas. Now, of course, we now sort of all accept, because of post-colonial theory and things like this, we now all know that the British destroyed a ton of cultures and basically did irreparable damage, especially to places like India, which had a thriving sort of industrial infrastructure that was destroyed by the British to create an agricultural colony. We now know that the British did irreparable damage through their colonialism, but the British believed that they were going out and doing something good. They believed that it was their moral duty to spread Christianity. They believed that they needed to spread the products of Western civilization. They needed to bring manufactured goods to different places and things like this. They needed to create stable governments. They needed to bring medicine and science and technology and things like this to their colonies. And a sort of disinterested evaluation of British colonialism will acknowledge that they brought a lot of improvements to the colonies, but it's hard to sort of evaluate things evenly because they also destroyed a lot of cultures and they killed a lot of people between wars of conquest, oppressing uprisings, and wars for control. A lot of people were killed in the colonial project. A lot of people were impoverished. A lot of people were displaced from their homes, and so on and so on. And of course, you sort of, if you go beyond the human cost, as post-colonial theorists do, you look at things like the fact that a lot of indigenous languages were destroyed. So, I mean, it became a crime at some times and places to speak, say, Zulu or Xhosa or languages like this, Bantu. These languages that were sort of indigenous to South Africa, for instance, it became a crime for people to speak those languages, or for children to speak those languages in school. No government business was done in those languages. Everything was done in English. So you have this cultural oppression. And part of that cultural oppression involves forcing people to speak the language of the colonizer, which is a really sort of disorienting experience, and it really undermines one's cultural identity. But, again, I mean, and I think it's hard to talk about the British view of themselves today without that post-colonial position sort of reasserting itself. I mean, and I'm struggling to set my discussion in the Victorian era as opposed to my 21st century post-colonial self coming along and saying, no, there's actually a lot of terrible stuff that was done. Again, the British thought that they were doing something quite good, and they thought that it was a task for them, that it was a responsibility for them, rather than something that was primarily beneficial to them. And we got this in week 3 when we read Rudyard Kipling's The White Man's Burden. There was this idea that it was a task that had to be accomplished, rather than this idea that the British were going out and creating empire for their own selfish purposes. And we can, I think, look at that very cynically today and say, well, it's clear that the empire primarily benefited the British, which is true. But I think it's also true that the British in the Victorian era didn't see it that way. They saw it as a mutually beneficial arrangement through which they brought civilization, Christianity, technology, science, medicine, and a sort of paradoxical peace and stability to the colonies in exchange for raw materials, markets to sell goods in, and global political power. But I mean, Britain was, again, and I've said this, I think, in other video lectures, and I've said this in lecture notes, Britain was the first truly global superpower because their empire spanned the entire world, and there was the famous saying that the sun never sets on the British Empire. And the reason that was the case was because no matter what time of day it was, the sun was always up somewhere in the British Empire, whether that was the Pacific Islands, whether that was India, Africa, Britain, Australia, Canada. There's somewhere that it was daytime in the British Empire, which, I mean, in itself is kind of amazing. But this made Britain really the first world superpower, and it was a contested power, but it wasn't a seriously contested power really until World War I. And no one ever rivaled them in imperial ambitions until arguably the contemporary U.S. Or contemporary sort of transnational corporations. That's a totally different issue. So, I mean, this power, this status of the empire gave the British a sense that they were at a high point in history, that they were somehow sort of chosen to sit at the apex of history and to be the dominant world power and the dominant world civilization. And this really shaped the way that they saw themselves. They had this sort of sense of their important mission in the world, and I think that's the way that we have to kind of understand the British Empire if we want to take it on its own Victorian terms, is that it was their mission from history, their mission from God. It was not a thing that the British felt was their choice. It was a thing they felt was imposed upon them by historical necessity.